I will talk about cultural heritage and peace building and conflict transformation. And as Andrea told you, I come from a background, the field of architectural history and conservation, restoration, by initial training. So that's what I got my academic training in first, and also passion. So I really liked historic buildings, specifically ruins, buildings that weren't in good condition. And so they needed some tender, loving care. And especially what I liked were places which had a difficult cultural history, a difficult past. Sometimes it's called contested heritage or dark heritage. And really such places are very, very complex, also shifting creatures of memory. So they're not, I mean, they are of course stable and sitting there, but for me, they're quite dynamic and they have some memory inside them. There's maybe memory that is difficult for some people don't want to remember it, and it's really in that stone and concrete, but it's also in the people who are living there. So it's in also the tangible but also intangible things that make up the landscape around it. And so the people living there, who live there, keep the memory alive. The people who love that place keep the memory alive. The people who hate that place also keep the memory alive and give it meaning. So you can see that there isn't only one meaning. So the meaning that people who love a place and hate a place will not be the same. And this already is a conflict. But all these people, all their interactions with a place, a place of culture, heritage, a historic site, and with one another. So these people are a very powerful, in a way, a force, and it's a very, very complicated web of relationships, of conflicts. It connects, the past to the present, the person to the person, person to the place, and place to a meaning. And so it's just this web of relationships that I love looking at. And so I was working on these places, and these are all in Anatolia, in Turkey. So geographically it's Anatolia, and I really liked working with these places. And nobody was taking care of them, and my specialization was Christian heritage. So that's what I studied also, how to work on it, how to interpret, conserve it. And these are monasteries, and nobody was taking care of them. And there were hundreds of them in Turkey. Churches, so all Christian churches, chapels. You can see these are all around the geography of Turkey. And so I decided, okay, I'm gonna be a professor. I'm gonna research on this, write on this, and people will restore it, I guess, right? No, I did that and it didn't work. And I realized I had to go into activism because these buildings belong to a difficult past. So they're difficult cultural heritage. They're cultural heritage that the current, Turkish government doesn't really want to engage with. It doesn't want to even engage with that conflict of, remembering this Christian heritage that Turkey has. So I founded an NGO, and we did work on these buildings, not to restore them, because of course they don't belong to us. They belong to many different stakeholders. That's a big problem also. And when I was working with these, I realized it's really not about the building, and we know really well how to conserve buildings. Scientifically, I've had the laboratory training of what you use when you're working on which kind of crack, which kind of material. That's easy because it's hard science. The difficult part is working with people who are no longer living there. They're diaspora, the people who own it today, the people who don't want you to even visit it, who are kind of living in that village now and belong to another culture or religion. So there were so many different conflicts that I needed to work with. And I realized, as an architectural conservation person, as an heritage, manager, I need another skill set. And so I did a postdoc in human rights and historical dialogue. And then I got some training on mediation once, like a very short training. And I fell in love with it. I thought, this is what I need to know. This is what I need to learn. So then I got proper training to become a qualified mediator, because there were these questions that everybody well, people weren't asking because the answers are quite conflicting. You know, who considers what heritage? Why? You know, which buildings do they conserve? What do they leave to be destroyed? You know, which ones are ignored, excluded? You know, which ones are interpreted in what way? So this was really a field where you had to know how to mediate if you were going to even enter a site where people were like, no, you know, you can't enter that place. Why? They don't want to talk. You have to find a way to talk with those people and explain why you are there, what you want to do, what those buildings mean. So we did a lot of work documenting, of course. So these are scientific documentations, but we also did exhibitions. This is one we did in Istanbul about a previously Greek neighborhood that transformed, and now it's very different. And so this, in a way, it's even exhibitions can be a way of, you know, mediating between something very difficult to acknowledge and people who don't know about it, for example, or people who are skeptical towards it. So this is kind of interpretation of conflict, heritage of conflict can be done through exhibitions, and it can be done also really creatively. And this was one thing I loved, I really enjoyed working on how to use a difficult conflict and show it in a way where people can really, like, it's like, you know, in mediation, you phrase something differently, and let's look at it from this direction. Let's think of it again. And this, in a way, I think exhibitions can be good mediators too for people. We also did trainings. And now, so from my story, I'd like to move on to a general story about, you know, how we can use this for peace building, for mediation. And I'd like anybody who has an answer to this question to just unmute themselves. I will show a photo of a building. It's in an ex-country, I'm not telling where, which also has all the heritage of all these civilizations. So does anybody know which country may have in its past all these civilizations which were in that country, you know, were founded there, spent some time there? And I'll show you the photo of a building there. Any guesses? This is a difficult question, although sometimes people who know it, of course, like, will answer straight away, but no. Okay, so this is an amazing big chunk of, when you think of it, like all these civilizations were in one single country. Yes, and that's Afghanistan. And for me, it was really mind-blowing when I learned about Afghanistan's cultural heritage, because, you know, really we have so little coverage of what's there, what's happening there in the media in terms of normal news. In terms of cultural heritage, we have even less. And this building here is called the Nohgunbad Mosque. It's from the 9th century, and we think it's probably the oldest mosque in Central Asia. And I'm saying probably, I'm saying we think, because this is such an uncharted territory. Sadly, so few people have actually studied this place that we don't know what's there. We don't know what was there. We don't know what is destroyed. So we're probably losing something as we speak, knowing what's happening there, unfortunately, politically. Another photo, which probably you're more familiar with. This is, of course, in Afghanistan, it was the bombing, the dynamiting actually, of the Bamiyan Buddhas, which were in the rock face. And I'll show you how it used to be in the past. So this is before and after. And this, again, in Afghanistan, I mean, which with this, you know, it had, so this is the Bamiyan Valley, but also in Afghanistan, there's the center of, you know, Buddhism and Zoroastrianism, a city called Balkh. But these particular Buddha reliefs, so these huge reliefs, I mean, look at these people down here. These are amazing. And they are 1,500 years old. And they were dynamited like this in March 2001. And I remember watching this. How did I watch it? Because it was televised, because the Taliban wanted to show the world that it had, you know, now it's from this country in conflict, it owned this region, and so it could decide what was considered heritage, what could be destroyed just because they owned it. They thought they had rights over doing whatever they wanted with it. And so this was viewed around the world. It was internationally televised. So now, unfortunately, you know, and it was, of course, internationally condemned. UNESCO wrote statements and so on saying, you know, not good, but then it's gone. It's not there anymore. They did this kind of like 3D projection at one point with some money that came from like the Far East. So some people donated the money, but then this is powered by petrol, and the petrol died, and that was, you know, for a certain time. But now we don't know what's happening. This was before the Taliban took over again last year. And today the heritage there is at serious risk of again being attacked and destroyed. Whatever is there, whatever we do not even know, we know. Also the collapse of all cultural management structures that were built up in the recent years, especially through international support. So there was a lot of money from Italy, for example, from China, going into conserving the past of Afghanistan. Now we don't know what's happening to those institutions, to those buildings. And this is a huge problem. And I really, this is a bittersweet sign from, I don't know what state it is in. It says a nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. And it was outside the Afghan National Museum. I wonder what's happening, what happened to that right now. And this was the former British Council director of Afghanistan, and you can see there, this was a photo from when their offices were attacked again by the Taliban. So it is ongoing conflict, and see how it relates so much to culture, because its culture is a good target to show people that I will do whatever I want with this piece of culture that belongs to you, or something you treasure, or your ancestors. And so cultural relations, and he said this, Paul Smith, of which protecting cultural heritage is a critical constituent, is the mature, long-term version of short-term public diplomacy and soft power. So soft diplomacy, we can also say. So using culture and heritage in any kind of conflict resolution is very, very important. And also it's sometimes a really good way of making people understand the conflict from another softer side. Another example, this is again from a monument. It's from the Arch of Titus in Rome. So if you go to Rome, so to the other side of the world, you will see this. It's in an inner panel here, and we see the victors, the people who have been victorious, carrying away booty, so what they've kind of stolen from the other side, from the destruction of the temple of in Jerusalem in 70 AD. And you can see they're carrying all these precious things, and this is, you may have recognized, this is now a symbol of the emblem of the state of Israel. This is a menorah, so this is when they were carrying booty. So, you know, heritage and all these, you know, symbols of heritage, things we produce and we treasure, are very important. There's things that are even solidified in things like the Arch of Titus, of being, you know, we now are victorious, we claim what is yours culturally, and we can do whatever we want with it. And so cultural heritage is a two-edged sword. It can be instrumentalized as a trigger for and targeting conflicts and crises, which I showed with the dynamiting of the Bamiyan Buddhas by Taliban in 2001. And can be subject to disinformation or manipulation of information. I mean, for example, the Hagia Sophia Mosque, well, is now a mosque in Turkey, but it was originally a basilica, so a Christian space of worship. And then when the Turkish Republic was founded, it was turned into a monument. So the Turkish Republic was founded as a secular republic. And so the Hagia Sophia, it as a symbol of the secular republic, wasn't turned into a mosque after the Ottoman times, because during the Ottoman times, it was a mosque. so after Byzantine, first basilica, then mosque, but in the secular republic, it was used, so, as a symbol of a secular country. It was a museum you could enter, and it was looked after. But now it's kind of manipulated to be a symbol of the current government, which is which has a lot of pro-Islamic ideals. So you can see how they're again using it as a factor, also, for example, to make the Christian world quite angry. The Turkish government did this. But also the other edge is that it can be a very important vehicle for peace, democracy, and sustainable development, because it fosters tolerance, mutual understanding, reconciliation, intercultural and interfaith dialogue. It can mitigate social tensions and also prevent escalation into violent conflict. This is all, from examples that have happened around the world when using cultural heritage. So this is so I'm going to talk from now on about the pros of using cultural heritage for peace building. You can prevent violent extremism and inclusive dialogue when you bring people together over a piece of cultural heritage, because we're not talking about each other at that point. We're talking through an object, through a building, which puts the conflict kind of somewhere else and is easier to talk with. Also, it brings us together. It's, it can be a building where, for example, there are a lot of mosques in Turkey where Armenian, so Christian stonemasons worked. Even we have mosques which Christians designed. So when you think of it in that way, you can bring people together over a piece of cultural heritage. Or, for example, cultural heritage is also food. It's also rituals, and you can bring people together over. For example, let's have a workshop where we cook together our own meals, and people, eating and drinking always brings people together, and it can ease conflicts in the sense, can provide at least the first, open door to easing conflict and to create common ground for dialogue and enhance peace. And this, I'm showing this because there is also some legal conclusions in the European Commission that were passed, and this one was on the EU peace mediation. And I remember when this came out, I was extremely happy that this was something that is now being officially discussed. And when they're talking about peace mediation, they now recognize that important cultural heritage is to prevent conflicts, to resolve conflicts, and to promote the sustainability of peace afterwards. And so they say we should educate people on peace, on conflict transformation, on mediation, negotiation, whatever, and use cultural heritage. So so everybody can think of, I guess, one form of cultural heritage or another. I said, it can be songs, they can be rituals, recipes, libraries, archives, sometimes pilgrimage routes, sayings, stories. So they're not always buildings. I'm an architectural historian, so I love using buildings as examples, but I mean, it's a huge ecosystem really, and it can take different forms. But from the examples I've tried to give, I hope you understand that it's never neutral. So cultural heritage it's really never neutral. It's never not political, because it's situated within a much wider context of very gendered power relations and political, social, and economic dynamics. So as I said, what to restore is not always a question of whether you have the money. You don't want to spend money on something because you don't want that to be conserved or to be remembered. So any engagement with cultural heritage is always political, and it always has an impact on the power dynamics in whichever context it is. And of course, the conflict dynamics when we're talking about difficult heritage. So I'll go over. So what's, working with cultural heritage, what do I look at? What I looked at in my experience was, what can we use in cultural heritage? How did the conflict affect that? How do people attitudes on the conflict reflect on this building? How can we change it through the building? Can we bring people together through this, complex place or rituals or past? And it was really, understanding the conflict, being sensitive to it, being able to analyze it from not an architectural part, but from a really peace builder conflict transformation mindset was very eye-opening for me, because I understood so many dynamics that you never see if you're, coming from the restoration point of view. And then I saw really the conflicts which were rooted in very long-standing disputes over people's identity, over, resources or power. And I understood other things much clearer. For example, vandalism. This is a photo of Sulpice. I think they had a fire in 2019 nowadays. Anyway, any kind of vandalism. I think this was vandalism or not. Anyway, I think it's a very powerful photo of an amazing site that, again, can be destroyed in, seconds. And they had some very important paintings inside this church. And now, because I have studied, because I'm a mediator, I understand vandalism on sites like this, or difficult cultural heritage sites, much more clearer. I know about conflict escalation, for example, and for that, which in a way is one of the most, destructive forces on the planet. Somebody said this, I think, because it causes people to do really, really extreme, terrible sorts of things, which they would not consider doing generally, I think, including at the extreme, genocidal violence and potentially, even nuclear war. And so it's, the enemy is not, in a way, it's not the other side. It's the enemy here is conflict escalation, because it makes people, at one point, at the very end of the spiral of violence, say, I can even be okay to destroying myself as long as the other side is also destroyed. And that's how I know that, these amazing, beautiful, like artworks or so on, can be vandalized, because people do not, at one point, they're so blinded by the, escalated conflict, that they do not see the, historical value of this or anything. They just see it as, a pawn in the conflict, and they just want to destroy it. And even if you're crying in front of that and asking people please not to do that, they still won't. They're so blinded that they will do it. And sometimes, this is a photo from Yemen, sometimes conflicts are, cultural heritage is useful as a pre-warning before conflict. So you can get signals of upcoming violent conflicts by looking at, some small vandalism that is happening on historic structures, which, have an identity conflict happening around them. And really, for example, there was the example in Yemen, where the destruction of cultural heritage predated the start of the current conflict, for example. There's a report on this, a document which lists, I think, 34 or something sites, some which are like 3,000 years old, which suffered severe damage before the outbreak of the current conflict. So it could, if you're looking very closely at, damage, it can signal something big is going to happen. Be aware and, de-escalate if you can the conflict in this case. So, and so at this point, I would like to move on to giving some examples of how peace building conflict transformation can also be mapped over, for example, migration, religion, through giving some examples. So of these opportunities, because you have a lot of people working, for example, I know, some of people in civil society work specifically on religion, specifically on migration. It's a big subject, for the last 2 decades now. And how is, for example, cultural heritage important when you're working in conflicts in migration? For example, the intangible cultural heritage that immigrants carry, you know, their songs, their rituals, are in danger of being forgotten when they're left behind. But if you allow them to practice that where they go, if you work with that, it can also be a tool of integrating them into a new society. And so we should really embrace this role as a part of welcoming refugees, of migrants, and also fostering social cohesion. Let's host an evening where we're having Ukrainian refugees in Berlin teach us their two desserts, you know, national desserts, for example. In terms of religion, this is again like when you have religious conflicts, sometimes you have two parties who come from different religions and they argue on the religious level. But then once you look at the cultural heritage that was produced in that country, you see so many, even though it's, you know, they have multiple religions in, for example, a certain region, the heritage they produced is mostly common heritage. I mean, they use the same roads, paths, and migration routes within. They use the same language and so on, and they benefit from so much cultural exchange. So it's a shared past, and you can always build on that, a shared identity. So it's something beyond that religion which you can bring people together on. So, and develop these interpersonal relationships. Finally, this is a subject which I find really interesting and has a really good example, as you can see, the Sarajevo War Museum. This is a very particular example, but cultural heritage created during conflict also, surprisingly, does bring people together, sadly, and this is not a very happy part of it, but because this, for example, War Museum brings together people who had their childhood during wars, and they can bond over this, whether it doesn't matter which side they were on in wars. They all experienced war as a child, as a teenager, and they can commemorate the war, you know, beyond any narratives which gave rise to that war.